Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 33rd year, I talk to writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they might be planning for the future. It's a wider net than writers, however. We have had on occasionally a sculptor or a painter or a musician or an actor. So if you have an idea for a guest who might be a good fit for the Writer's Block, writer or other variety, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd love to get your suggestions. I also want to point out that the Writer's Block and all the other original programming that comes out of 1623 Studios is a result of cable access television, a really valuable community service here on Cape Ann. You don't get it with Dish. Stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight I'm happy to say we have a poet and journalist writer by the name of Laura Plummer, who is a fairly recent arrival on Gloucester, but has in the process discovered and written about very deep family roots in Gloucester. So I'm anxious to meet her and to talk about her discovery of the city and her roots. Laura, welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you.
Tell us something about your background, where you grew up, and how you migrated down eventually to Gloucester.
Okay, so I grew up in southern New Hampshire. I went to school at the University of New Hampshire in the Seacoast. And after graduating, I moved to Boston. I was in Boston for about 7 years, and I came to Gloucester in 2014.
2014, so you've been here for?
About 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
How did you pick Gloucester?
Well, at the time, we were looking for a 2-bedroom apartment that was affordable, which was getting really hard to find in Boston.
Yeah.
So we looked in Amesbury, we looked in Salem, we looked at a couple places in Gloucester, and we ended up finding a very good deal in Gloucester. And since my husband was commuting to Andover, it was kind of equidistant from Boston. So we ended up here.
Are you happy with it?
You know, we never thought we would stay as long as we have stayed. We ended up finding a really strong, solid community here, and we've always felt very welcome by the community. And so we ended up actually buying our first house here and putting down some roots in 2018, which we never thought was even remotely possible. So we really love it. It's really grown on us.
It still surprises me how often I hear that. People come to Gloucester and I don't know if it's personality or their previous background makes them ready for that, and I'm one of them. I came here and I fell in love with the city, and I've been here forever. So I'm glad you arrived and evidently fell in love with the city.
Yeah, it's been nice.
You've written for the Gloucester 400 Stories project, which I want to make sure we tell our audience about. Can you tell us something about the Gloucester 400 Stories project, connected, of course, with next year's 400th anniversary, and how you discovered that place to place your writing?
Sure. So I started working on this piece, which was originally for The Other Cape online magazine.
Originally
For The Other Cape. So it originally appeared in The Other Cape, which I had been writing for them for a couple years. So when I got this idea, I pitched it to them and they liked it. And so I continued with writing this story, basically looking into my Finnish roots here in Gloucester, which I didn't know existed until I moved here. So in the course of writing this, sharing it with various people, they would suggest, oh, you need to submit this to the Gloucester 400. So, and that's how I kind of got acquainted with the project.
So people knew about it, the Gloucester 400 Stories project.
Yes.
At first, I want to point out to our viewers, the Other Cape is a literary journal, and I don't want them to think you lived on that other Cape, that terrible other Cape.
No, this Cape.
literary journal.
Yep.
That you talked to the editors about.
Right.
Okay. And how did the process work once you discovered that the 400 Stories site existed?
Well, I knew that this piece would be very appropriate for it because they were specifically looking for oral histories and stories that haven't been told. And I knew that I had a very original piece here. Not only is it the story of myself coming here and discovering my roots, but uncovering the roots of a longtime Gloucester resident and giving her the chance to tell her story, which maybe would never have been told otherwise.
So, and were the people easy to work with?
You mean the folks that I ended up interviewing?
No, the people at the 400 Stories Project.
Oh,
Did they make,
yes.
I'm trying to encourage our viewers to write stories.
Oh, they were very
So-
welcoming, and they were very open to making collaborative edits all along the way. They're very respectful of their writers, and they allow their writers to have a lot of creative input, which I really appreciated. I would love to work with them in the future.
With the director of the writing project, Terry Weber, has been on the show. And
Great.
we, on that program and on this one, I want to encourage people to send in their stories. Whether
Absolutely.
they've been here for 80 years or been here for 8 years, because they're looking for stories.
Yep. So they're still seeking stories. The idea, I think, is to have 400 original stories to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the founding of Gloucester. But I'm not sure that's a firm number, but they take stories in really all formats, whether it's biographies, oral histories, poetry even. So I would definitely encourage anyone who has a story to be told to submit to them.
Good, good. I hope that everybody hears that and sends in. I think they're still looking for stories, and I don't know if they're going to get to 400. That's a lot of stories.
It's a lot, but I know that they're working really diligently,
yeah.
and hopefully it will be a full
Yeah.
project.
So you discovered, kind of after you moved here in 2014, you said,
Mm-hmm.
that you have some Finnish background. There's a huge active Finnish community here, as you know. How did you discover that background?
It's really fascinating. I've always personally been very interested in genealogy and ancestry, and I've in the past put together my own kind of DNA profile. I've always been really interested about where my ancestors came from. I always knew I had Finnish ancestors on my mom's side, but I didn't really know too much about them or their culture. And it wasn't until I came to Gloucester that I started learning a little bit more about the Finnish contribution to the American fabric. And that was really inspiring to me personally. And of course, as I got to know people through different cultural events on the island, it only kind of increased my interest in learning about that.
On the island, I like that reference. You know we're on an island right now. I'm very happy to have you talking about the 400th and bring that article. We've done many shows about Gloucester because of the anniversary. That's why I'm wearing my Gloucester sweatshirt tonight. And I wonder if you could share that story about your Finnish background with us.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. It's a little long, so I'll break it up a little bit. And I'm going to try my best to pronounce the Finnish words and names correctly, but I don't speak Finnish. So it's called The Bones of My Ancestors. Quote, "We all carry inside us people who came before us. My husband and I moved to Gloucester in 2014, seeking cheaper rent and the perks of island living. However, as we followed the coastline up from Boston with our few possessions in tow, I sensed another force guiding us northward, like a ship to a lighthouse. I quickly became aware of the waves of immigrants that had shaped the city. The area's Finnish history fascinated me. According to genetic tests, I was approximately 1/8 Finnish. Hoping to learn about my heritage, I joined the Cape Ann Finns and attended Finnish cultural events on the island. I began building a family tree for my known Finnish relation, my great-grandfather, Chester Peterson. He was from Marion, Massachusetts, so I started there. My sources included census records, certificates of birth, death, and marriage, and newspaper archives. I scoured genealogy websites and consulted genealogy experts. I found evidence of Chester's life in Marion starting at age 13. Class photos from 1916 and 1917, a 1926 marriage certificate, a 1942 World War II draft card, census records from 1920 through 1950, and a 1964 obituary. What I failed to locate was a record of his early childhood. Revisiting his marriage certificate, I saw he had listed his birthplace as Gloucester. The ancestral connection to my new home intrigued me, but I didn't pursue the lead right away. When I resumed my investigation, it revealed local roots dating back at least 130 years.
So this is a break at this point. So you discovered this ancestor from Marion, I think you said, but he was actually born
In Gloucester.
in Gloucester. And that's the big jump.
Yeah, and I think that his family thought that he was born in Finland. I'm pretty sure no one knew there was a Gloucester connection there, because on my mom's side of the family, they believed that he just came from Finland, like he was a first generation.
He was born in Finland.
He was not.
He was not born in
But
Finland.
that might have been what he told them to avoid telling them the full story of how he ended up in Cape Cod when his whole family remained in Gloucester. Which is still
shortcut,
right? Which is
him.
a bit of a mystery, because sometime between the age of, prior to the age of 13, he ended up on Cape Cod while his whole family was in Gloucester, remained in Gloucester, and it's really a mystery
and you don't
how
know the answer
or
yet.
why. At this point in my research, I don't have an answer as to why.
So that's the point where you discovered Gloucester. That he was born, your grandfather, great-grandfather,
My mother's grandfather. So
your
it's my great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather was actually born in Gloucester. Okay,
Yes.
so now, where do you go from here now?
So just a little bit of background. Finland was under Russian rule from 1809 to 1917, and over 200,000 Finns had immigrated to the US by the early 20th century seeking freedom and opportunity. Recruiters guided them to specific communities like Cape Ann, which needed skilled laborers to work in its many quarries. Matti Petkalkangas was born in 1857 in the village of Kuusa in Haapajärvi, Western Finland. One of 7 children, he regularly attended Holy Communion until 1886 when he left for America. He found work as a stonecutter and blacksmith in the quarries of Gloucester. There, he learned to speak English. Kaisa Josefina Harjunpää was born in 1866 in Teuva, Western Finland. On June 26, 1891, she received her passport and departed for the United States. Josephine, as she was known, was working as a maid in Gloucester when she met a Finnish laborer 10 years her senior. In 1891, Benjamin Harrison was president. Women could not vote. Carnegie Hall held its first concert, and Thomas Edison unveiled his early motion picture device. And on Christmas Eve, Matti and Josephine married in Gloucester and rented a room at 42 Langsford Street. These were my great-great-grandparents. The family name was changed to Peterson as the children came. Josephina was born 1895, Lovisa in 1897, and Matt Jr. in 1899, though infant cholera claimed the boy a year later. A 4th child perished prior to 1900. At 974 Washington Street, the couple welcomed Andrew in 1901, Chester in 1903, and John in 1905. In May of 1906, baby John was admitted to Addison Gilbert Hospital with burns. Josephine became pregnant again in February of 1907. By late April, the brood lived at 10 Munsey Lane. Husband and father Matti suffered from general ill health. In May, he passed away after a brief battle with pneumonia. He was 49. In June, while the family lived at 26 Willow Street, John died in the hospital just shy of his second birthday. When Ludwig arrived in November, Josephine was a young widow with 5 hungry mouths to feed. To make ends meet, she began taking in Finnish boarders. The clan resided at 23 Arthur Street in 1908. In 1910, Josephine operated a boarding house at 391 Main Street. Josephina and Lovisa, then 14 and 13, were working as live-in servants for other Gloucester families. They would eventually leave the city and never return. Lovisa would marry at 16. By 1916, Chester lived 100 miles away in Marion. Josephine moved Andrew and Ludwig to 39 Willow Street in 1917. That same year, Lovisa succumbed to a bacterial infection. She was 20. In 1918, Josephine stayed at 37.5 Sargent Street, though she would be back at the Willow Street address from 1919 to 1922. In 1922, the family returned to the Sargent Street house, where Josephine would remain until her death. By 1926, Andrew had relocated to Pennsylvania and married a Finnish girl with whom he immigrated to Finland. Ludwig was the sole child of Josephine, who never left her side. Josephine Peterson had come to America seeking a more prosperous existence. While she did become self-employed, her life was mainly one of struggle, uncertainty, and heartbreak. On September 5th, 1928, she passed away at 62, having buried her husband and half of her children. If not for Ludwig, my ancestors' legacy on Cape Ann would have ended there. But Josephine's last-born followed in the footsteps of the father he never met, becoming a prominent stonecutter and carpenter. A month after burying his mother, he married a local Finnish girl. Ludwig brought his teenage bride to a one-room cabin overlooking a private quarry where they would have 3 children. He named his only daughter Louise in honor of his late sister Lovisa. Chester also named his youngest daughter, my Nana, Louise. It was a testament to how much their big sister had meant to the boys.
This is wonderful detail, and I want to point out to our audience that on the 400 Stories website, where your story runs, where they can find it, there are many pictures of the locations, the houses, I think a couple of them still standing, where your ancestors lived back 100 and more years ago. So it became, for me, when I was reading it, very alive. These people became very alive, not just numbers. Did you get most of this information out of the documents archives at City Hall?
So it was really, it was a mix of sources. I was in the archives at the Cape Ann Museum. They had a lot of information as far as where the families lived and moved and who was living there at the time. The census records that are in public record were extremely useful. And of course, the 1950 census was just released this year. I think it was back in the spring. So that was a huge wealth of information.
So this is a lot of work. It's a lot of research work.
It's a lot of work, but it's really fun work.
Did your major at the University of New Hampshire prepare you for this? Or did you work on sociology-related topics or not?
Interestingly, so my major was Spanish and international affairs, but we had to do a fair amount of research projects. And I actually did some research assistantships for various professors because I've always loved the process of research. So that gave me a really great, strong background.
Good.
And of course, I've worked in journalism for a very long time. So I have a journalistic research background as well. So kind of just combined my skills.
I recommend that our audience see this on the website with the pictures. And I appreciate it. Can you finish reading that for us now?
Mm-hmm. There's 2 more sections. Living history. By the time I started my research, Ludwig's offspring would have been almost 90, and I assumed they were deceased When I learned that Louise was not only alive, but living in Gloucester, I immediately set out to find her. My late grandmother's cousin was 89 and my last living relative from her generation. What first struck me was her size. Louise shared my Nana's petite jeans. I next noticed her lavender-tinted white hair, which she wore in a short, stylish shag. She greeted me sporting gold hoop earrings, a gold cross necklace, and gold-framed sunglasses on top of her head. I accepted that Louise might not be eager to talk about the events of her past if she could even remember them. To my delight, I encountered a woman whose memory was exceptionally sharp and who seemed to have been waiting for someone to examine her long and interesting life. She presented a stack of albums containing hundreds of years of photos. Containing 100 years of photos. Each picture sparked a memory, described in vivid detail. I put faces to names I had only read in government documents. I wondered how the individuals in the images would feel about me telling their stories. From that initial visit, Louise embraced me like a long-lost relative and indulged my endless curiosity. She was as eager to know what I had uncovered concerning our shared origins as she was to tell her stories. I would show up with muffins and my notebook and listen to her reminisce. She was born the middle child at the Quarry House in 1933. In the post-Depression years, the family lived hand to mouth, sometimes having to trap pigeons for food. They used an outhouse and hauled water up from a well for cooking and cleaning. My neighbors had money and a nice house, Louise recalled. They called my house the shack. But quarry life also offered built-in recreation. Trees provided endless entertainment in rope swings, hide and seek, and climbing. Louise and her brothers raced each other across the frozen water on skates in winter. In summer, there was no better place to cool off. I considered myself the best swimmer around, Louise said, but I was afraid to swim out too far. We had big eels in my quarry and snapping turtles. Louise's maternal grandmother, Mummo, instilled in her an appreciation of Finnish culture. She would take Louise polka dancing at Wainola Hall on Langsford Street, the center of Finnish social life on Cape Ann. Afterward, dancers would enjoy a buffet of traditional food. There was niswa. It was a big round donut, plain and covered with sugar. It was delicious, she said. Louise was not as fond of her grandmother's villi, a fermented yogurt popular in Finland. She still remembered the Finnish phrases her mummo had taught her, rattling off the translations of good Finnish girl and good Finnish boy. If my grandmother wanted us to be quiet, she'd say, ole hiljaa. If I wanted to tell somebody off, I'd say, hasta menoen paska. I won't say what that means. Louise was a student at Lane School at the corner of Washington Street and Morgan Avenue from grades 1 to 6. Most of her peers were Finnish like herself. She and her brothers walked to and from school with the other Finnish children from the neighborhood. Everything was different then, she told me. All the Finnish people knew each other. For grades 7 and 8, Louise went to Central Grammar School. One summer, Chester brought his daughters from Marion to visit. Despite bonding quickly due to their shared name and age, Louise and my Nana would meet just once after that. Louise attended Gloucester High School for 2 years. She left at 16 to work at Harbor Cove Fisheries, where she and other girls wrapped and packed the daily catch as it came off the boats. The manager was Finnish, and she liked me because I was a good worker, Louise said. She made me the box girl. I used to make the boxes, carry them from the barn on my shoulder, and put them down the chute. At 18, Louise left for Western Massachusetts, where she married and raised her children. When I met her, she had only returned a few years earlier to be close to the kin that still called Gloucester home. Incredibly, the Quarry House was still in the family 5 generations later.
That is an amazing fact. Now, is that a section end, or is that, did you finish? I want to.
There's a small section left.
We have only 3 minutes left.
Okay.
So I want to see if you, how much do you have to, I want to see if you can finish it.
Sure, I can finish that.
Okay.
With a map of Cape Ann on my passenger seat, I journeyed around the island, stopping at all the locations where my forefathers had lived. Some addresses no longer existed. Others looked as they might have more than a century ago. I had passed these sites dozens of times before, unaware of my connection to them. One site on my road trip back in time was 2 acres of rugged terrain deep in the woods of Gloucester. I approached a rustic dwelling with a clapboard exterior that idled at the edge of a small private quarry. The residence had been expanded upon over the decades, but the original structure where Louise was born still perched above the quarry on pillars of stacked stone. A granite staircase descended from the weathered deck directly into the water, daring me to dive in. I envisioned my great-granduncle Ludwig chopping wood for the next addition or shed he planned to build. A teenage Louise and my Nana lounged lazily on the stone staircase, dipping their toes into the cool water as they gossiped. And my great-grandfather Chester raced his nephews to the buoy, marking an old lobster pot. My final stop was Seaside Cemetery, a hilly expanse of grassy roads with headstones dating back to the mid-1800s. The groundskeeper pointed out where the bones of my ancestors were buried in unmarked graves. I imagined cutting stones for a living, but not having one to mark my grave. In 2014, I washed up on Gloucester's rocky shores by mere coincidence. Or maybe my ancestors were calling me to this place because they wanted their stories told. After all, in their own small ways, they helped make the city what it is today.
That is an excellent story, and I'm sure your ancestors knew that you were writing that story, and they were drawing you closer and closer to Gloucester and having you write that story. That's a riveting story. I loved it when I read it the first time on Gloucester 400 Stories, and I love listening to it again. And I want to thank your ancestors for leading you towards Gloucester and leading you to write this piece. It's a wonderful piece, and all our audience can see it for themselves and see the pictures that go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
We are already at the end of the hour. I want to thank you, Laura Plummer, very much for sharing this story about your ancestors. They came alive for me in your story, and I feel they're here. We've had many Finnish guests on the show, so they'll appreciate it too. Thank you for coming down.
Thanks so much.
I want to thank everybody in our TV audience too for being with us this evening. If you've learned something about Laura Plummer's ancestry here, her Finnish saga, and all of the relatives that came alive for you this evening, and will come alive again when you read her story online, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you next time on the Writer's Block. Good night.